This is Sound and Vision from KEXP. Ray LaCourte runs an Instagram page called BIPOC Punk. KEXP's Martin Douglas caught up with LaCourte to talk more about his life, music, and his Instagram page.
Before we get into BIPOC Punk, tell me about your history with music and discovering punk.
It dates back to, I would say, when I was, a teenager in the Philippines, in Manila. That's when a lot of the British post-punk and new wave hit. Early 80s, we had a radio station that was called The Edge. And for us, that was the source of a lot of inspiration. Bands such as the Smiths, Joy Division, Gang of Four were just ones that I really gravitated to quickly.
What led you to the United States?
My mom was a diplomat for the Philippine government, so we bounced around from Australia back to Manila and then Seattle, where I pretty much have called home for the past 30-odd years.
In your experience going to shows in both Australia, I assume, and Seattle, tell me about the atmosphere, because I'm thinking about of course, this calls back to my personal experience in first going to shows in Seattle and being like the only Black person, sometimes the only person of color, period, in the room. So how was it for you?
Yeah, I have to say, the years I spent in Australia, I was a young, primary school student, so grade school. So I didn't really have an opportunity to go to shows in Australia. So it was really only in Seattle that I started going to punk rock shows. But certainly, as you mentioned, Martin, noticing that, I was one of very few BIPOC people in the crowd, let alone performers on stage.
Yeah.
So when you did see somebody you identified with on stage, for example, seeing Versus, which, being Filipino and seeing 3 Filipino members of the band performing, and it helped that I was a big fan of their music, but certainly seeing people that you can identify with really does contribute to that community feel to the music and the kinship that you can generate from that.
Remember, you're already gone into
you talking about seeing Versus. I remember one of the first shows I went to when I regularly started going to shows. It was 2005. It was Block Party. There was a line around the block to get into Numos. And I got in, and it was me and Kelly Oakricky, the lead singer, who were the only 2 Black people in the entire building.
Wow. And when I was listening to Block Party, I was not aware of what the members looked like. Mm-hmm. And to me, they just, sounded like a great band. And then, of course, after starting BIPOC Punk and featuring Block Party, seeing the feedback about how important they were for many BIPOC people, Britain and elsewhere, and the style that they carry on stage is quite different and stood out for a lot of people.
Absolutely. But I wanted to first get into how going to shows and seeing yourself represented on stage morphed into you developing this project to illuminate BIPOC voices in the punk and alternative scenes.
It's certainly my DNA to feel like, I was going to be a minority, so to speak, in a crowd. I think growing up in Australia, being one of very, very few brown kids around wherever I went, I'm kind of used to having that. And Seattle, for all its great diversity, shows were still very much, predominantly Caucasian in the audience.
Especially back in the day.
Correct. Yeah. And so, fast forward several years with the digital age and just looking at, my own feed on social media and getting frustrated, I would say, the lack of representation of BIPOC. And that would be the genesis, really, if I were to pinpoint why I started this.
Were there any artists or groups that you had come to be surprised by when you were doing your research? Like, oh, there were people of color in this band. I know that there are quite a few bands where I was like, oh, there's a black person in this band. Oh, there's an Asian person in this band. Oh, that's cool. In your research for BIPOC Punk, did you come to anything of that level of surprise?
I would say, well, before starting BIPOC Punk in 2019, seeing documentaries about Death, the band in Detroit. The number one biggest game is when they think number fame is like a race at the top because they want to be boss. They don't care who they step on as long as they get along. Politicians in my eyes. And of course, coming across Bad Brains. And Pure Hell. And how these bands were pioneers in what they did.
Absolutely.
And being proto-punk or whatever tag you want to give them, they were there in the forefront. And so not so much to your question of being surprised that they were black, but knowing that there are these bands that were there from the beginning and not just jumping on whatever trend. So yeah, I would say that can extend to the LA Mexican American, East LA, I should say, bands that included the Brat.
It's only attitude, my attitude.
Plugs.
A gang, a loss, no matter the cost.
Los Illegals.
Couldn't speak us language, we took me away. Is this the price you have to pay when you come to the USA?
The Bags.
The Bags. Alice Bag is to many just punk rock royalty.
Survival is the game, can't stop us now, it's gone in vain.
And many of those bands weren't heralded back in the day, and even so now. So it's great to see when I do a post about the Brat, it goes viral, and people are just scratching their heads, especially those who were in the scene and yet failed to learn about the Brat.
Yeah.
And so we're educating ourselves and others who are into that music.
Yeah, I think it does a great thing, BIPOC Punk, in that it de-emphasizes the whiteness of punk rock music, of the punk rock community, because I feel as though the idea of there always being people of color around and people having elders, like when I talked to Hanif Abdurraqib, he was telling me that when he came up in the punk scene, like, he had lots of black punk elders. And I found that to be greatly surprising because I came from North Carolina, where nobody I knew who was black listened to this music. Or even here in Seattle, like, well into adulthood, like seeing like 2, maybe 3 other people of color in the crowd at a punk show. So I think that's really cool. And the idea that BIPOC Punk is emphasizing this and sort of expanding that community and having people young and old find it and say, yeah, like I'm not the only kid in the crowd here that looks like me. I think it's wonderful.
That's well said, Martin. I also feel like BIPOC Punk comes at a time where you're noticing members of the LGBTQ community, women, artists of color, and just seeing a movement of sorts to the front, and how bands like Zulu and Soul Glow. I go to my coffee shop and I see a young Caucasian barista wearing a Soul Glow shirt, and they, just saw them perform. And these bands that I mentioned are these young black hardcore punk bands, which are growing in numbers and in voice. And the fact that New York Times wrote an article about them last summer just shows there has been this seismic shift of who is in these bands, and it's typically those who have something to say.
Yeah.
And feel very strongly that they need to, scream it out loud.
Yeah, and like going in with this shift, there are also bands like the Linda Lindas, and I think it's cool that there's this band of all young women of color who have white fans and are introducing white fans to
That's
punk
great.
rock.
That's great.
Growing up isn't something you can make happen when you want it to. But since we're all growing up together, I guess I'll grow up with you.
Is there anything that you would like to see more of as far as BIPOC people participating in the punk scene? I mean, this could be like a pie in the sky sort of wish.
Yeah, I would say that it's happening in many circles, but there still is a very Caucasian-dominated landscape, and I think maybe that's a reflection of society, but I'd like to think that the representation that BIPOC shows and displays could be mirrored in other places. And so just continue to see that wave of change and improvements in how bands who may not necessarily be talking about their identity are given more play and more chances. And as I said, I'm seeing that improvement, but I'd love for that to continue on.
Hell yeah.
That was Ray LaCourte of the Instagram page BIPOC Punk speaking with KEXP's Martin Douglas.